This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Servile State by Hilaire Belloc. Section 9. This moral strain, therefore, arising from the divergence between what our laws and moral phrases pretend and what our society actually is, makes of that society an utterly unstable thing. The spiritual thesis is of far greater gravity than the narrow materialism of a generation now passing might imagine. Spiritual conflict is more fruitful of instability in the state than conflict of any other kind, and there is acute spiritual conflict in every man's conscience and ill ease throughout the commonwealth, when the realities of society are divorced from the moral base of its institution. The second strain which we have noted in capitalism, its second element of instability, consists in the fact that capitalism destroys security. Experience is enough to save us any delay upon this main point of our matter, but even without experience we could reason with absolute certitude from the very nature of capitalism that its chief effect would be the destruction of security in human life. Combine these two elements, the ownership of the means of production by very few, the political freedom of owners and non-owners alike, there follows immediately from that combination a competitive market, wherein the labour of the non-owner fetches just what it is worth, not as full productive power, but as productive power which will leave a surplus to the capitalist. It fetches nothing when the labourer cannot work more in proportion to the pace at which he is driven, less in middle age than in youth, less in old age than in middle age, nothing in sickness, nothing in despair. A man in a position to accumulate the normal result of human labour, a man founded upon property in sufficient amount and in established form, is no more productive in his non-productive moments than is a proletarian, but his life is balanced and regulated by his reception of rent and interest as well as wages. Surplus values come to him, and are the flywheel balancing the extremes of his life and carrying him over his bad times. With the proletarian it cannot be so. The aspect from capital looks at a human being whose labour it proposes to purchase, cuts right across that normal aspect of human life from which we all regard our own affections, duties, and character. A man thinks of himself, of his chances, and of his security along the line of his own individual existence from birth to death. Capital, purchasing his labour, and not the man himself, purchases but a cross-section of his life, his moments of activity. For the rest he must fend for himself. But to fend for yourself when you have nothing is to starve. As a matter of fact, where a few possess the means of production, perfectly free political conditions are impossible. A perfect capitalist state cannot exist, though we have come nearer to it in modern England than other and more fortunate nations had thought possible. In the perfect capitalist state there would be no food available for the non-owner save when he was actually engaged in production, and that absurdity would, by quickly ending all human lives save those of the owners, put a term to the arrangement. If you left men completely free under a capitalist system, there would be so heavy a mortality from starvation as would dry up the sources of labour in a very short time. Imagine the dispossessed to be ideally perfect cowards, the possessors to consider nothing whatever except the buying of their labour in the cheapest market, and the system would break down from the death of children and of our works and of women. You would not have a state in mere decline, such as ours is. You would have a state manifestly and patently perishing. As a fact, of course, capitalism cannot proceed to its own logical extreme. So long as the political freedom of all citizens is granted, the freedom of the few possessors of food to grant or withhold it, of the many non-possessors to strike any bargain at all lest they lack it, to exercise such freedom fully is to starve the very young, the old, the impotent, and the despairing to death. Capitalism must keep alive by non-capitalist methods great masses of the population who would otherwise starve to death. And that is what Capitalism was careful to do in an increasing extent as it got a stronger and stronger grip upon the English people. Elizabeth's Poor Law at the beginning of the business, the Poor Law of 1834, coming at a moment when nearly half England had passed into the grip of Capitalism, are original and primitive instances. There are today 100 others. Though this cause of insecurity, the fact that possessors have no direct incentive to keep men alive, is logically the most obvious and always the most enduring under a capitalist system, there is another cause more poignant in its effect upon human life. That other cause is the competitive anarchy in production which restricted ownership coupled with freedom involves. Consider what is involved by the very process of production, where the implements and the soil are in the hands of a few whose motives for causing the proletariat to produce is not the use of the wealth created, but the enjoyment by those possessors of surplus value or profit. If full political freedom be allowed to any two such possessors of implements and stores, each will effectively watch his market, attempt to undersell the other, tend to overproduce at the end of some season of extra demand for his article, thus glut the market, only to suffer a period of depression afterwards, and so forth. Again, the capitalist free individual director of production will miscalculate. Sometimes he will fail, and his work will be shut down. Again, a mass of isolated, imperfectly instructed, competing units cannot but direct their clashing efforts at an enormous waste, and that waste will fluctuate. Most commissions, most advertisements, most parades are examples of this waste. If this waste of effort could be made a constant, the parasitical employment it afforded would be a constant too. But of its nature it is a most inconstant thing, and the employment it affords is therefore necessarily precarious. The concrete translation of this is the insecurity of the commercial traveller, the advertising agent, the insurance agent, and every form of touting and cozening which competitive capitalism carries with it. Now here again, as in the case of the insecurity produced by age and sickness, capitalism cannot be pursued to its logical conclusion, and it is the element of freedom which suffers. Competition is, as a fact, restricted to an increasing extent by an understanding between the competitors, accompanied especially in this country by the ruin of the smaller competitor through secret conspiracies entered into by the larger men, and supported by the secret political forces of the state. In a word, capitalism, proving almost as unstable to the owners as to the non-owners, is tending towards stability by losing its essential character of political freedom. No better proof of the instability of capitalism as a system could be desired. Take any one of the numerous trusts which now control English industry and have made of modern England the type quoted throughout the continent of artificial monopolies. If the full formula of capitalism were accepted by our courts and our executive statesmen, any one could start a rival business, undersell those trusts, and shatter the competitive security they afforded to industry within their field. The reason that no one does this is political freedom. Before any trust is established in this country, the first step is to interest one of our politicians. The telephones, the South Wales Coal Trust, the happily defeated Soap Trust, the Soda, Fish and Fruit Trusts are examples in point. Freedom is not, as a fact, protected here by the courts in commercial affairs. A man attempting to compete with one of our great English trusts would find himself at once undersold. He might, by all the spirit of Europe law for centuries, indict those who would ruin him, citing them for a conspiracy in restraint of trade. Of this conspiracy he would find the judge and the politicians most heartily in support. But it must always be remembered that these conspiracies in restraint of trade, which are the mark of modern England, are in themselves a mark of the transition from the true capitalist phase to another. Under the essential conditions of capitalism, under a perfect political freedom, such conspiracies would be punished by the courts for what they are, to wit, a contravention of the fundamental doctrine of political liberty. For this doctrine, while it gives any man the right to make any contract he chooses with any labourer, and offers the produce at such price as he sees fit, also involves the protection of that liberty by the punishment of any conspiracy that may have monopoly for its object. If such perfect freedom is no longer attempted, if monopolies are permitted and fostered, it is because the unnatural strain to which freedom, coupled with restricted ownership, gives rise, the insecurity of its mere competition, the anarchy of its productive methods, have at last proved intolerable. I have already delayed more than was necessary in this section upon the causes which render a capitalist state essentially unstable. I might have treated the matter empirically, taking for granted the observation which all my readers must have made, that capitalism is as a fact doomed, and that the capitalist state has already passed into its first phase of transition. We are clearly no longer possessed of that absolute political freedom which true capitalism essentially demands. The insecurity involved, coupled with the divorce between our traditional morals and the facts of society, have already introduced such novel features as the permission of conspiracy among both possessors and non-possessors, the compulsion provision of security through state action, and all these reforms, implicit or explicit, the tendency of which I am about to examine. Section 6. The stable solutions of this instability. Given a capitalist state of its nature unstable, it will tend to reach stability by some method or another. It is the definition of unstable equilibrium that a body in unstable equilibrium is seeking a stable equilibrium. For instance, a pyramid balanced upon its apex is in an unstable equilibrium, which simply means that a slight force one way or the other will make it fall into a position where it will repose. Similarly, certain chemical mixtures are said to be in unstable equilibrium when their constituent parts have such affinity for one another that a slight shock may make them combine and transform the chemical arrangement of the whole. Of this sort are explosives. If the capitalist state is in an unstable equilibrium, this only means that it is seeking a stable equilibrium, and that capitalism cannot but be transformed into some other arrangement wherein society may repose. There are but three social arrangements which can replace capitalism: slavery, socialism, and property. I may imagine a mixture of any two of these three, or of all the three, but each is a dominant type, and from the very nature of the problem no fourth arrangement can be devised. The problem turns, remember, upon the control of the means of production. Capitalism means that his control is vested in the hands of a few, while political freedom is the appanage of all. If this anomaly cannot endure from its insecurity and from its own contradiction with its presumed moral basis, you must either have a transformation of the one or of the other of the two elements which combined have been found unworkable. These two factors are the ownership of the means of production by a few, and the freedom of all. To solve capitalism you must get rid of restricted ownership or freedom, or of both. Now there is only one alternative to freedom, which is the negation of it. Either a man is free to work and not to work as he pleases, or he may be liable to a legal compulsion to work backed by the forces of the state. In the first he is a free man. In the second he is by definition a slave. We have therefore, so far as this factor of freedom is concerned, no choice between a number of changes, but only the opportunity of one, to wit, the establishment of slavery in place of freedom. Such a solution, the direct, immediate, and conscious re-establishment of slavery, would provide a true solution of the problem which capitalism offers. It would guarantee, under workable regulations, sufficiency and security for the dispossessed. Such a solution, as I shall show, is the probable goal which our society will in fact approach. To its immediate and conscious acceptance, however, there is an obstacle, A direct and conscious establishment of slavery as a solution of the problem of Capitalism, the surviving Christian tradition of our civilisation compels men to reject. No reformer will advocate it, no prophet dares take it as yet for granted. All theories of a reformed society will therefore attempt at first to leave untouched the factor of freedom among the elements which make up Capitalism, and will concern themselves with some change in the factor of property. Now, in attempting to remedy the evils of Capitalism by remedying that one of its two factors which consists in an ill distribution of property, you have two, and only two, courses open to you. The end of section 9.